Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Jack Storm, and this is The World Today, right here on El Radio Phoenix. Wednesday, August 26, 2026. Tonight, hopes for a diplomatic opening in the Strait of Hormuz are giving financial markets some breathing room, but the war involving Iran remains far from resolved. The United States is increasing economic pressure on Tehran, while Iran and Oman resume discussions aimed at managing shipping through one of the world's most important energy corridors. Here at home, the midterm political battle is heating up, with Republicans and Democrats preparing very different messages for voters. The Supreme Court has given the Trump administration a temporary victory in its fight over mail-in voting. The United States and Canada are moving deeper into a trade dispute. And in the Caribbean, a U.S. military strike on a suspected drug smuggling vessel has killed 4 people, drawing sharply different reactions from Washington and international human rights organizations. We'll also take you to Brazil, Mexico, Ukraine, Wall Street, and the world of sports. This is The World Today, real news, straight down the middle. Let's begin. Top story: Iran, Hormuz, and the global economy. There may be a little breathing room tonight in one of the world's most dangerous economic flashpoints. Iran says it has restarted talks with Oman concerning the Strait of Hormuz. The development comes as the United States continues increasing economic pressure on Tehran. The strait is critical to global energy markets. Before the war, roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil moved through the waterway. Brent crude fell more than 2% today to around $86.45 a barrel as traders responded to the possibility that shipping through the strait could eventually resume more normally. But here's the important part: the strait isn't back to normal. Shipping remains heavily disrupted. So while oil traders are optimistic, they aren't declaring victory. And that's why investors are watching every development between Washington, Tehran, and the countries attempting to mediate. The Trump administration says economic pressure is necessary to weaken Iran's ability to continue the conflict. Iran says Washington is imposing unlawful pressure and has vowed to resist. The diplomatic question now is whether economic pressure and mediation can produce an actual agreement. For consumers, the question is much simpler: what happens to gasoline prices? Because when oil moves, the effects can eventually reach transportation, manufacturing, food prices, and inflation. Washington Trump administration faces political test. The Iran war is becoming one of the most politically complicated issues facing Washington. The administration argues that confronting Iran is necessary for American national security. Critics question the length of the conflict, the cost, and what the ultimate objective is. And Americans are watching the economy at the same time. That makes this more than a foreign policy debate. It's becoming a domestic political issue. Republicans are likely to emphasize national security, military strength, and the argument that Iran must be prevented from rebuilding its ability to threaten American interests. Democrats are increasingly focusing on the cost of the conflict, the impact on Americans, and whether the administration has clearly defined an endgame. And voters will ultimately decide which argument they find more convincing. Our job is not to tell you which one to choose. Our job is to make sure you hear both. Midterm politics: Republicans and Democrats prepare for November. The 2026 midterm elections are getting closer, and the political battle is becoming more intense. Republicans want the campaign centered on national security, immigration, crime, and the Trump administration's agenda. Democrats are looking to make the election about the cost of living, health care, government accountability, and dissatisfaction with the administration's policies. And last night's Republican Senate primary runoff in South Carolina produced another important result. Darlene Graham, the sister of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, won the Republican nomination for the Senate seat. Her victory was helped by endorsements from President Trump and Senator Tim Scott. That race gives us another indication of just how important Trump's endorsement remains inside the Republican Party. But the larger question is, what happens in November? Midterms are often referendums on the party in power. The president's party usually faces significant challenges, but Republicans will argue that their policies need more time to produce results. Democrats will argue that voters have already had enough time to judge them, and that battle is only beginning. Mail-in voting Supreme Court battle continues. The Supreme Court has given President Trump's administration a temporary victory involving mail-in voting. The court lifted a lower court order blocking portions of Trump's executive order dealing with mail ballots. But this is not the end of the legal battle. Other challenges remain. The administration argues that stronger rules are needed to protect election security and make sure ballots are cast by eligible voters. Opponents argue that the federal government is interfering with state control over elections and could create unnecessary barriers for legitimate voters. The issue is likely to remain politically explosive as the November elections approach. And this is exactly the kind of story where facts matter more than political slogans. Election security matters, voting access matters, and the courts will ultimately determine how much authority belongs to Washington and how much remains with the states. U.S.-Canada trade war gets more serious. The United States and Canada are now in a significant trade confrontation. President Trump has threatened additional 50% tariffs affecting Canadian vehicles, auto parts, and steel. Canada is responding with tariffs of its own. The dispute threatens one of the world's largest and most interconnected trading relationships. Automobiles cross the border. Energy crosses the border. Food crosses the border. Manufacturing components cross the border. So when governments impose tariffs, businesses have choices. They can absorb the cost, they can reduce production, they can change suppliers, or they can pass the cost along to consumers. And that's why trade policy eventually becomes kitchen table economics. Both governments say they are protecting their national interests, but the longer the dispute continues, the greater the potential economic consequences. Money and markets, Wall Street watches. Nvidia. Now let's talk about your money. Global markets are showing some relief today as oil prices decline, but Wall Street is focused on two major developments: inflation and Nvidia. U.S. stock futures were relatively flat ahead of Nvidia's earnings report and new U.S. inflation data. Investors want to know whether the enormous artificial intelligence investment boom can continue producing the profits Wall Street expects. Nvidia has become one of the most important companies in the AI economy. Its chips power many of the world's largest AI data centers. Analysts are expecting extremely strong growth, but expectations are also extremely high, and that's the danger. A company can produce excellent results and still see its stock fall if investors expected something even better. At the same time, traders are watching inflation because it could influence Federal Reserve interest rate decisions. Oil falling is good news, but the market still wants to see whether that translates into lower inflation. The national debt, $40 trillion and counting. And there is another number Washington cannot ignore. The U.S. national debt has crossed $40 trillion. This isn't simply a Republican problem. It isn't simply a Democratic problem. The debt has grown substantially under administrations of both parties. Republicans generally emphasize spending restraint and economic growth. Democrats generally argue that revenue increases and protecting major social programs must be part of the solution. But regardless of which party is in office, interest payments are becoming a larger part of the federal budget. And eventually, Washington will have to confront a basic question. How does the United States pay for everything it promises? That's a question neither political party can avoid forever. Latin America. Brazil's presidential race tightens. Now we head south. Brazil's presidential election is shaping up to be one of the most closely watched political contests in the Western Hemisphere. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is facing Senator Flávio Bolsonaro in a race that remains extremely competitive. A recent poll has the two candidates effectively tied in a potential runoff. Other polling has shown Lula with a narrow advantage. The election is scheduled for October, and the stakes extend far beyond Brazil. Brazil is Latin America's largest economy. The next government will influence relations with the United States, China, and other Latin American nations. It will also influence fiscal policy, energy, environmental policy, and security. Financial analysts are already looking closely at what each candidate's economic program could mean for Brazil's debt and public finances. And once again, our rule applies. We cover the candidates. We cover the policies. We cover the numbers. You make the decision. Mexico Sinaloa governor faces pressure. In Mexico, Sinaloa Governor Rubén Rocha Moya remains under intense political pressure. U.S. federal prosecutors have accused Rocha of drug trafficking, bribery, and protecting cartel interests. Rocha denies the allegations. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has criticized his decision to briefly return to office while the controversy continues, calling the move inappropriate. Rocha has again requested a leave of absence. This story is particularly important because Sinaloa is one of Mexico's most significant regions in the battle against organized crime. It also highlights the complicated relationship between Mexico and the United States. Washington wants stronger action against cartels. Mexico insists that its sovereignty must be respected. And both governments say they want to stop the flow of drugs and weapons across the border. How they accomplish that remains one of the biggest challenges facing North America. The Caribbean U.S. military strikes suspected drug smuggling vessel. A major story is developing in the Caribbean. The U.S. military says 4 people were killed in a strike against a vessel it identified as being involved in narcotics trafficking. Washington says the operation targeted what it describes as narco-traffickers. Human rights organizations and UN experts have condemned the campaign, arguing that the strikes amount to unlawful extrajudicial killings. The U.S. military says intelligence confirmed the vessel's involvement in drug trafficking. The individuals killed have not been publicly identified. The strike is part of a broader campaign that Washington says is aimed at disrupting drug trafficking networks. According to Reuters, more than 210 people have been killed in strikes against suspected drug smuggling vessels in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific since the campaign began. This is a serious story, and it raises serious questions. How aggressively should the United States use military force against suspected drug traffickers? What level of evidence is required before lethal force is used? And how should international law apply? Those are questions that deserve answers regardless of political party. Trinidad and Tobago Energy Project put on hold. Trinidad and Tobago Energy Project is facing an energy setback. Shell has shelved its Aphrodite offshore natural gas project after disagreements with Trinidad's national gas company over commercial terms. The project was expected to produce approximately 100 million cubic feet of natural gas per day. For Trinidad and Tobago, natural gas is a major part of the national economy, so the delay comes at a difficult time as the country attempts to maintain production and protect its LNG and petrochemical industries. The project may eventually return, but for now, the future remains uncertain. Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. In Ukraine, the war continues while diplomatic efforts remain uncertain. A Ukrainian official recently criticized the country's military strategy and warned that Kyiv needs urgent decisions if it is to change the course of the war. Russia has seized on those comments as evidence of political infighting inside Ukraine. Ukraine's government has pushed back, arguing that the former official's criticism is influenced by his removal from office. Meanwhile, fighting continues. A Ukrainian drone attack reportedly caused a major fire at a Russian Wildberries logistics warehouse in the Tambov region, with officials reporting casualties. And CIA Director John Ratcliffe held talks with Russian intelligence officials during a visit to Moscow, although he did not meet President Vladimir Putin. That suggests that even while fighting continues, intelligence and diplomatic channels remain active behind the scenes. Middle East, Gaza, and the West Bank. The conflict involving Israel and the Palestinians continues to produce political and humanitarian consequences. In Washington, 42 Democratic senators have urged Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to address what they describe as a surge in violence by West Bank settlers and mass arrests of Palestinians. The letter represents a significant position within the Senate Democratic caucus. At the same time, the broader Gaza conflict remains unresolved, and the humanitarian situation continues to be closely watched by international organizations. This remains one of the most politically divisive foreign policy issues in Washington. And again, we'll separate the facts from the political arguments. Sports. Baseball. The Seattle Mariners had a night to remember. Cal Raleigh hit 3 home runs as Seattle defeated Philadelphia 9-2 and ended the Phillies' 9-game winning streak. Raleigh became the first Mariners player to hit 3 home runs in a game at T-Mobile Park. And with the regular season moving toward its final weeks, every win becomes increasingly important. Tennis. The U.S. Open is here. The U.S. Open is underway, and tennis has already produced one of the tournament's biggest stories. Serena Williams returned to competition alongside Carlos Alcaraz in mixed doubles, producing a victory in the opening round. The tournament is now moving toward the main singles competition, with the world's top players preparing for one of tennis's biggest stages. For American fans, the next 2 weeks should provide plenty of drama. College football, Big Ten, and SEC change eligibility rules. And there is a major development in college football. The Big Ten and SEC have adopted rules preventing players who have previously played for an NFL team from returning to compete at one of their schools. The decision follows a court ruling in Louisiana that unexpectedly gave several undrafted NFL free agents another year of NCAA eligibility. The conferences responded quickly. This is another example of how complicated college athletics has become in the era of NIL money, transfers, lawsuits, and changing eligibility rules. The big picture. So, what should you take away from today's headlines? First, the Iran conflict is still the biggest international story affecting the global economy. Second, oil prices are providing some relief, but the Strait of Hormuz remains a major risk. Third, Washington is heading into a major political season, with Republicans and Democrats offering sharply different visions for the country. Fourth, the U.S.-Canada trade dispute could affect businesses and consumers on both sides of the border. Fifth, Latin America is entering a politically important period, particularly with Brazil's presidential election approaching. And sixth, the Caribbean is increasingly becoming part of America's broader security strategy. These stories aren't isolated. They are connected. Energy affects inflation. Inflation affects interest rates. Interest rates affect your mortgage and your investments. Trade affects prices. Politics affects trade. And international conflicts can affect everything. That's why understanding the news matters. Now, do not forget, the world keeps turning, the headlines keep coming, and this is our world. And in closing, the job of a news program isn't to tell you what to believe. It's to give you enough information to decide for yourself. Tonight, we've heard arguments from Republicans. We've heard arguments from Democrats. We've heard Washington's position. We've heard the opposition. We've heard governments defending their actions. And we've heard their critics. That's what journalism should do. Not tell you which team to cheer for, give you the facts, give you the context, and let you make up your own mind. I'm Jack Storm. This has been The World Today on El Radio Phoenix. Real news, straight down the middle. Stay informed, stay curious. And remember, the headline is only the beginning of the story. I'm Jack Storm, and this is Our World.